Welcome. You're a veteran at this, but I'm a newbie to this, so.
This is my second.
Oh, you're grizzled at this point. You're grizzled. Thanks very much. So we thought we would, Rob and I just met backstage here a minute ago, and we thought we would try to provoke a little bit of a conversation. I'd like to introduce some geopolitics into this conference. I feel it's incumbent upon me, whether Rob will agree or not, I don't know, to say that, I believe that there is a giant freight train bearing down on this conference center and everyone in it. And what I mean by that is the potential for significant regulatory disruption in the quantum space is, I believe, very real and in the not too distant future. I think that locomotive is really driven by two different sources of power. One, there is a policymaker fear of technology. So I am not a tech guy. I'm a policy nerd. I'm a creature of Washington, D.C. And the Stimson Center is a nonprofit public policy think tank that works almost exclusively with governments, though we do work with the private tech sector. Our clients really are governments, not just in this country, but around the world. And what we do is try to find those positive applications, those positive use cases of technology to solve and meet challenges of public policy, grand challenges that society faces. Now, the Stimson Center focuses almost exclusively, not entirely, on issues of national and international security, of foreign policy issues. And I will say that this tangible fear that policymakers have of technology is real. We don't understand your world, and we aren't quite sure how to access your world either. That may be a good thing for some in this room, but I'm going to make the argument that it is a potentially negative thing. The second thing that I think is driving this is Washington's penchant for applying security to almost every challenge of public policy. This has become especially true after 9/11, but on virtually every issue that you can imagine that is facing our country today, from climate to issues of hard security and weapons proliferation, that security label is applied to it, and it is almost the first prism that Washington looks through to address any challenges. It is certainly the issue that elevates an issue to the top of the policymaker's agenda, if we can say that there are security considerations. So I want to say two words about that, and I want to get this guy in because he actually knows something about quantum, and I really want to try to drive with you, Rob, a conversation particularly about China. And you have a new report that I think is really useful for these folks to hear. But let me just say two quick things to try to animate those two kind of driving factors of why I think that locomotive is bearing down on this room. So a colleague of mine at the Stimson Center, his name is Matt Burrows. He spent 35 years working for the intelligence community. His last job was at the National Intelligence Council. And the role of the NIC, the National Intelligence Council, is to try to draw a bridge between the intelligence community and policy. And what it's best known for is the production of the so-called global trends reports. And we can all read these reports because they are now declassified. There's a declassified version of them, even when they're released. And Matt Burrows was responsible for running those global trends exercises. They're essentially foresight exercises, so not predicting the future, but trying to identify alternative scenarios that we could be moving down. He did this twice for President Bush and once for President Obama. So he's a veteran in this. And if you go back and look at those global trends exercises, they are remarkably accurate. Right? So they're looking 15 plus years out. They're remarkable. They predicted the pandemic. They predicted chaos in the Middle East. They predicted a resurgent Russia. They predicted competition with China. And virtually every issue that we are wrestling with today, you can find in those early reports from those years. The one thing that they got consistently wrong was the timeline of the challenges that they identified. And it was really driven by two things. One, it's really hard to do this. And that it's hard because crises accelerate other crises. So you have a challenge in the Middle East, which foments problems elsewhere around the world. So that's one. But the larger challenge that the National Intelligence Council has, and that Matt describes, is the pace of technology development and innovation is always underestimated by Washington, D.C. We always think that we don't have much confidence in you all in this room. We always think you're much slower than you actually are. And therefore, challenges accelerate at and it's an important point. I want to ask you to just park that for a moment in the back of your brains, because it's important and it's driving a dynamic in Washington, D.C. that identifies technology not often as an opportunity, but more often as a challenge. And that's really important. Second, the other, I think, factor that is driving that locomotive, as I mentioned, is this overriding notion that security trumps all other policy decisions in this town. And I think that that's not an understatement. I will say that it will come as a surprise to no one in this room that there's not a whole lot of consensus in Washington, D.C. these days between Republicans and Democrats. There's only one issue that I've identified in my time here as a truly bipartisan issue today, and that is that China is an enemy that must be defeated, and that there's a race to the right, that there's no downside for a politician of getting to the right of another and being more strident and more even confrontational at times with China. Now that may be a good thing, but it also has implications for everyone, I think, in this room, because it is driving a sense that quantum and other technology innovation is a threat that has to be competed on the international stage, and that China is the prime competitor to the United States in this space. My fear, and Rob, I wanted you to lean in on this, my fear is that we have developed a fallacy in this town, that we can identify choke points in the technology process, in broad technology supply chains, and essentially stunt the ability of competitors like China from competing effectively with the United States. And I think Rob and I are going to get into a fist fight probably on that point. But Rob, you just released a report recently on this very issue, and I wonder if you talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, thanks, Brian. So I lead a think tank, ITIF, ITIF.org, and we've been focused on the challenge from Chinese innovation for a long time. And we're wrapping up a 2-year study, which will be rolled out at a hearing in Congress or session in Congress next week, that's looked at 10 major Chinese industries and looking at trying to answer this question: how innovative are Chinese firms relative to global best practice? And so we've looked at robotics, EVs, nuclear power, chemicals, AI, semiconductors, and we released a report on quantum on 2 days ago. 1 day ago, Monday. And I 100% agree. With Brian, when we were, the last time there was a major, what some people are tech economists call a long wave of innovation. So there's a sort of theory about innovation that innovation isn't linear, it comes in waves, it comes in chunks. And that was a title of my subject of my first book. It was called Long Waves of Innovation, the Power Cycles of Growth. And you could argue that the last big wave was in the 90s with computing and IT and the internet. And what was unique about that period relative to today were two things. One, we didn't really face any competitors. We really didn't. The Japanese were clueless about what you could call Wintelism, Windows and Intel and the internet. They just were clueless about it. TCP, IP. The Europeans, they were out to lunch. China didn't, they were still riding bicycles. And the second thing we had back then is we had this view, which was an accurate view, that we were so technologically powerful that we could essentially turn the spigot off on anybody, anytime, and basically, really penalize them. And we would use that power, oftentimes with abandonment. And we still have that view in Washington today, that we're so powerful that if we wanted to really use export controls to hurt the Chinese, we could do that. And that's what we're doing. And secondly, that we really don't have to worry too much about China. And it pains me to say that's almost become more the view than the other view. You hear all this language now about peak China. the Chinese threat relative to the US has peaked, and the Chinese are only going to go down for all these reasons. And besides, they're a Marxist-Leninist country. We all know that they can't innovate. Both of those are completely wrong, in my view. They're incredibly innovative, and they're a long, long way from peaking. And so when you look at what China's doing, I got this report last month from the Chinese government, and July 18th, 2024, a resolution of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China on further deepening reform comprehensively to advance Chinese modernization. They love these long, long titles. But what's interesting in here, I'll read this one part here. We will establish a mechanism for ensuring funding increases for industries of the future and improve the policy and governance systems for promoting strategic industries such as blah, 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 and quantum technology. So when you listen to the debate tonight between the two candidates, this would be a drinking game. Take a shot for every time you hear quantum. Or take a shot for every time you hear advanced technology. I guarantee you will be sober by the end of the debate because we don't talk about that. So if you look at what China's doing, China's, to be fair, there's a lot of opacity. You're not quite sure what's going on. But our take is that the Chinese government is spending more on quantum development, R&D and development, than the rest of the world governments combined. So think about that. One government is spending more than everybody else combined, not even like equal. Now, to be fair, US companies and sort of allied OECD companies are spending more in terms of company R&D. There's no question about that. The Chinese companies are not as advanced. We have better companies, no question about that. But in our assessment, first of all, the amount of money they're spending isn't meaningless. That gets you something. They have a Chinese Science and Technology University where they have this massive, massive quantum center where they have over 50 companies all bounded together around all of this research. I mean, so they take this quite seriously. And the other component there is when we looked at it, our assessment was the Chinese are significantly, or they're at least ahead of us in quantum communications. We're sort of on par with them on quantum sensing, and we're ahead, the West being ahead on computing. But they're making very fast strides. And let me just close by saying two final things. One is the US government, we look at this as a giant science project. The Chinese look at it as a giant technology project. And it's very different. If you look at it as a science project, which is how NSF and the National Quantum Initiative think about it, you want to fund science, and then you want to publish those articles, and you want to go to conferences, and you want to share that information. Well, the problem with that is you're sharing it with the Chinese inherently. We are giving them incredible amounts of knowledge. The Chinese don't share anywhere near as much of what they produce in terms of knowledge, number one. And number two, if you know your sort of TRL levels, they're a little bit farther down. They're looking at trying to develop the technology, and we're looking at trying to develop the science. Now, of course, you have to do both. Of course, particularly on a technology that's so new. But my point being, the Chinese see this as a major national initiative where they want to act, and very, very quickly, they want to drive this all through. Half of their funding goes through the Ministry of Science and Technology. Whereas we look at it, well, you got a little bit of quantum funding over here in DOE, and you got a little bit of here maybe in the Army, and you got a little bit here at NSF, and how do you find it, and what do you do with it? So we don't really have, I would argue, a coherent and competent national quantum initiative. If we did, and there's been calls for this, and we cite those to spend or invest $670 million a year, that's, to me, the minimum. We should be spending $2 billion a year on this. And I don't think we're going to do that because we don't take it quite seriously. And the second part is, I think we agree on this, but look, if I could figure out a way to not export pens to the Chinese, and they could not have pens, and therefore their entire writing system would fail, I'd be like, let's do it now. I am more than happy to slow down, do everything possible to limit Chinese technological advancement, because their technological advancement strategy and policies are predatory. They're not like what the Japanese are doing, or the Australians, or the Brits, or whatever, which is build things up, gain competitive advantage. Theirs is predatory. They want to win. They want everybody else to lose. The problem is, I don't know what we can do. You know, I know how to cut off Comac, which is their Boeing competitor. We just tell Westinghouse and GE, and if we can get Rolls-Royce in there, we just no more engines, man. They can't fly a plane without engines. We could kill Comac tomorrow if we could just get the 3 engine makers. Can't sell engines. I don't know what you would. What are the few things in quantum that they cannot get only from us? Because one of the things that I think it's important to understand, on this is the last point, and I don't say this in any partisan way. I was actually on the, I led the advanced emerging technology team for the Biden campaign. I don't say this in a partisan way, but many of the export controls that have been coming out of the US government, particularly in semiconductors and equipment, have been unilateral. They've been us controlling. So for example, we said, hey, Qualcomm and Intel, you can't sell to Huawei. And the result of that was we lost sales, and Huawei got 0 slowdown, because either they made the chips themselves, or they got them from the Japanese, or they got them from somebody else. So even if we had something that we think is valuable, it's not clear that we're ever going to be able to get our allies to all agree, because the allies don't want to agree, frankly. They want to be able to sell. So I think I'm with you on that. I think we have to be super, super careful. I think rather than focus on defense and how to slow them down, which I would do if we could, I think we have to focus a lot more on offense and how to really, really like take us from 40 miles an hour to 100 miles an hour.
So I wonder if you have advice, though, Rob, for people in this room. So as you rightly point out, you know, the efforts in Washington to control technology generally, whether it's quantum or, I mean, you pointed to semiconductors, which is really important. Someone said to me once that Washington has discovered semiconductors at the end of the Silicon era. I mean, we're always a little bit behind, maybe decades behind. But you know, the notion that we can control this technology it's not unreasonable, and I would argue it was born out of the nuclear era. The United States detonates a bomb in 1945. It takes until 1960 63 for the Chinese to really perfect the technology, which you may say, well, that's 15 years. It's quite successful. But you know, bear in mind that at that time we assumed that there would be 30 countries, 40 countries with nuclear weapons, that this technology was going to proliferate widely. But Washington and the Allies, you know, put these technology controls on. The technology was essentially owned by governments, right? It was not these people who owned the technology. But the world has changed now, right? Now we have not maybe understood that in Washington, that the world has changed quite so dramatically, and so we're driven by this assumption that we can continue, as the National Security Advisor says, you know, as small yard and high fence around particular technologies.
Well, now it's a 9-acre lot with a high fence.
Precisely. So, the question though is, you know, is there a way to balance these two worlds, right? This drive to want to slow the Chinese down, at the same time as we want these people to innovate and to move as quickly as they possibly can. It strikes me that those two worlds are really coming into collision, and I think the silicon or the semiconductor example is maybe a fantastic example that, you know, we made, you know, very positive efforts. Washington is on a sugar high in terms of its ability to impact in a negative way, Chinese purchase of Western semiconductors, and yet what it has done, they're good capitalists in China. It has driven a domestic market where we see, you know, and you know, my fear is that we are going to see something that we're going to say to everyone in this room: slow down. We're going to put restrictions on what you are doing in the name of security, and we are inadvertently going to drive a market in China that allows them to accelerate past where the United States could be, and then potentially inadvertently cut the United States out of future markets. It's worth noting that China trades more with the global south today than it does with all of the Western allies combined.
So I think one of the problems with how we frame this debate is there's a feeling among Washington policy elites, and including in this administration, that this all has to be framed in a sort of, well, we're limiting their military access. And so you hear Raimondo, Secretary of Commerce Raimondo say that, you hear Janet Yellen say that. And, look, no. We're limiting this because if we're going to limit it, we're limiting it because Chinese government is predatory. Their goal is to destroy American companies and Western companies. And if you look at our report coming out on Tuesday, you will see the quotes there from the State Council and others. It's pretty clear what they're doing. They've done trying it with telecom equipment, with solar panels. They're doing it with EVs. Their goal is the military part is only part of the threat. The second part of that is I think what we have to do is we have to do two things that I think would be effective. I don't know how we can control, and I was looking out there and thinking there's somebody out there making, these companies out there making little parts, cooling or something. I don't know how you would control that, and I think they can get that. But what we should do is two things. One is control knowledge diffusion. So I would just not let, I'm hawkish here, I would not let Chinese students be in quantum PhD programs in the US. I would certainly not let any American university engage in quantum research with China. Now, NSF, I'm actually testifying in a congressional hearing 2 weeks on this. NSF actually is funding a joint US-China quantum project. And I don't think we should do that. I think in that the idea is, well, we'll gain something and they'll gain something. In my experience with those things is they gain 80%, we gain 20%. I just wouldn't do it. So number one, I think we have to limit knowledge flows. And I think that will be something that if you're in a quantum company, you will see that. Particularly if President Trump is elected or reelected. And the second thing we should do is we should limit the access of Chinese quantum companies to our markets. And I say that because there's no Chinese quantum company that has developed organically, that has developed freely. They're all creatures of the state. They've all been massively subsidized by the state. Why would we let them have access to our markets? So I think that is a much more effective way of limiting their capabilities. If you cut their access off to our markets, the West essentially, you really do limit their revenues. Now, the argument well, they'll cut us off. Well, A, we're going to cut ourselves off, number one. And number two, they're going to cut us off anyway. The Chinese are very clear. If you look at the German auto sector now in China, the Germans are just like, oh man, we love China. We don't want to rock the boat because we're making all this money. Yeah, you're not making any more money. The Chinese have almost cut you out of that market, and it's a Chinese market only. Telecom, Chinese market only. Solar, Chinese market only. High-speed rail, Chinese market only. So that's where we're going with that. So I don't have any worries about us losing access to the Chinese quantum market because we're never going to get it to begin with.
Would you say, Rob, I'm going to challenge you a little bit on that, just in terms of on both those points. So first on regulating and controlling the flow of knowledge, right, which is a huge issue, right? It's not just in quantum; it's in multiple different. And we've proven ourselves to be pretty ineffective at that. No, it's a global marketplace, and knowledge is diffused, and So how do we practically, aside from saying, okay, well, we're not going to allow this company to hire someone who is, of Chinese origin to work in this, but it doesn't mean that I can be recruited by a Chinese company to go and, work in China.
You work for the governor of New York?
So it's a challenge. So how do we solve that problem? And then secondly, in terms of this issue of global markets, how do we address my fear is that we're by saying, look, let's section off the Chinese. The Chinese are still, they're intent on this technology. It doesn't, with the fact that we turn them off, as you pointed out, doesn't mean that they say, okay, well, look, quantum is closed to us. We'll go and play in another sandbox. They're going to continue to pursue this. And at the same time, they are pursuing global markets and other spaces. So could you foresee, if we pursue this path, could you foresee in 15 years a world where there are two quantum worlds? There's one that the United States lives in, and then there's the rest of the world that China owns and controls because we've separated ourselves. And is that a challenge?
Well, look, if I just wrote a long piece, it's coming out next week, I guess, arguing why the US and Europe need to form a very strong China alliance. So yeah, if we were the only ones doing this, yeah, we would be terrible. We would lose. But there are lots of countries that see the threat from China and would be, I think, very open to this. Particularly the Japanese would be at the top of the list. I think the Commonwealth countries would be along. I think Europe is gettable. So I wouldn't impose that just on our own because we would lose. You can't convince, it's like the Chinese, they're sort of like the Terminator, you can't dissuade them from any of this. I mean, I think we learned that in the Trump administration. They tried to change their behavior. You can't do that. They're not going to change. They know exactly what they want. It's rational for them to do it. But this is a very typical technology industry. It's a high fixed cost, low marginal cost industry. Building the first machine, it takes gazillions of dollars. Building the second machine is a lot cheaper. And so once you start to cut off that longer tail of sales, you're taking the most profitable part of a company's sales away. Because each time you make another one, your revenue is the same and your costs are going down. And so we don't have to cut off their entire market. I think the way it works is we could cut off a bunch of their market in the developed West, compete like heck in the developing world, better, I'm on this Chinese, or I was on this Exim Bank China Advisory Group, and they're doing a great job. They have a whole China initiative where I believe if you wanted to fund quantum exports to South Africa, making this up, or India, you can get support from it. So we absolutely have to do that. With regard to the knowledge flows, we had knowledge flow controls during the Cold War, and they were pretty darn effective when you think about it. We didn't let the Soviets come in here and get a PhD. We didn't do Soviet postdocs. Were they perfect? No, of course not. Knowledge flows, you can't lock it down, I get that, but you can put bumps in the road, you can slow things down. And I think that's the thing that we should be seriously thinking about. Like, for example, we have a thing called CFIUS, which is the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. And it's it's an interagency body that looks at foreign acquisitions of U.S. companies. I guarantee you, if you're in a quantum company, I guarantee you that you're going to be facing that someday because you might get asked by a foreign competitor to be acquired. There's no way we should ever allow a Chinese company to acquire an American quantum company. It'd be zero, never. So I think there's things we can do like that. Yeah, of course, we're not going to say you can't publish things in an article and go to a conference in France. Of course, that'll be still going on. But there are some things we can do.
So let's leave these folks with a bumper sticker, at least, to take away. For me, it is, I am convinced that the world is about to change pretty dramatically, irrespective of what happens a month from now in this country. That we are on a pathway to much more restrictive and potentially even aggressive regulations around technology controls and technology much more generally. And that this group, I think, needs to be ready for that. They need to be thinking in advance and not just how to prepare for it, how to shape it ultimately before they have to respond to it.
No, I totally agree. One of the mistakes I think a lot of technology companies make, particularly earlier stage industries, is they're so focused on their company, which is of course what you should be focused on, that this other stuff here is sort of like a little fly buzzing around. You can kind of ignore it. And I understand that. But to the extent you can meet with your local member of Congress, explain to them what this is all about, or if there are fly-ins, like I don't know if there's a fly-in here today where you would go up as a group and meet with different members of committees, or go talk to, OSTP, they know this stuff, Office of Science, Technology, Policy, but other parts of government are maybe less well informed. Absolutely, you should be doing that. The second thing I think you should be doing is there's a big push, and there are lots of different groups, the American physicists or all these groups, including us and you're pushing for quantum reauthorization, pushing for more money. Look, Washington is, people criticize Washington for what it is. We're in a democracy, and so if you got 100 people pushing for more food stamps and you got 2 people pushing for more quantum funding, food stamps is going to win. So to the extent you can also be an advocate for saying, look, this industry is critical to the West, it's critical to American success, and unless we have a much more effective and stronger and generous sets of policies, both for funding research, but almost equally important, training scientists and engineers who are going to be able to come out and understand this stuff, that's not going to happen unless you make a big push for it to happen.
And we didn't even have a fist fight, huh?
No, we were good.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.